I was really interested in the talk last night, the Michael Eisenberg. In a way, I put on my Facebook a post last night if I got back to my room saying that I couldn't believe I was sitting there and this guy was channeling all the things that I was thinking that I had thought, even put on Facebook myself, about the sharing economy. And it's sort of a good news, bad news story in a way. The good news is that I loved what he said so articulately and so dynamically. The bad news is, what did he leave for me to say? But in truth, I actually wasn't going to talk about that, and not everything he said I could agree with 100%. And so I think it was just a perfect setup for a lot of the things that we're going to discuss in the next few days. So, and now to my topic. Actually, this is also a good news, bad news story. The good news is that this is a story of success. It is the story of economic progress, of remarkable economic progress and prosperity. And the story of failure is the inability or reluctance of economists to appreciate and understand the first story. So I may have a very bold thesis here today. My thesis is that as a profession, economics has failed to deliver. The prosperity we have achieved is in spite of and not because of what we teach students of economics. All around the world, the ideas and models that form the basis of economic policy, of what economic advisors tell their policymakers, is hopelessly incomplete at best and often dead wrong. So I'm not being timid in this regard. I think, if anything, it might be a little bit of an overstatement because there are exceptions. I can think of Milton Friedman, who I was fortunate enough to have as a teacher at one time. And his policy advice had been a force for good throughout the world in many different places, in Chile and China and India and maybe even in Israel. So there are exceptions. But as a rule, this is the case. And I'm conscious of the fact that many of you are studying economics. How many are in? Yeah. So what I'm saying is perhaps a little bit provocative, and it is intended to be. So I want to begin, the two top parts to my talk today are the first, which may be familiar to you, the story of prosperity and where it comes from. And so I'm going to go maybe a little bit more quickly through that, with some emphasis on special parts. And the second part is on why there has been a failure by the economics profession to appreciate this and to apply these insights, where I'll go into perhaps a little bit more detail if I can. So we always begin our story with Adam Smith, right? And everybody knows that he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. What they perhaps don't know is the full title of that book. The full title of that book is The Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. So in other words, there's a question buried in the title of the book. And the question is, what is this wealth? Or two questions. What is this wealth? What is exactly wealth composed of? And secondly, what causes it? Where does it come from? You know, that was his question, and that's still our question. And it seems like we just go around it and come with some answers and then go back to re-examine it again and again. But in many respects, his answer is correct, maybe just not complete. And he was asking the question because of the dramatic changes that were taking place as he was writing the book. He was in Scotland, but in England at the time, there was this huge and dramatic change in the way that people lived. It is impossible almost to overstate the extent of the change that occurred, this new prosperity. You might say, if he were to channel Winston Churchill, if any of you know about Winston Churchill's speeches, he might have said, never before in history have so many lived so well. This is the so-called hockey stick picture that you may have seen, and that is often used. This comes from Douglas North's book on institutions and economic progress. It's population growth from about 1 million years ago. I don't know how they know that, but all the way up, you start getting an uptick over there. If you change the scale, this would be seen to be quite dramatic, but nothing like this, right? And because we don't have data going back on GDP and all these other kinds of things. So what we're talking about here are the things that allowed this change to take place. Things like life expectancy, health, nutrition, many of the basic things that came first with the agricultural revolution and then ultimately with the industrial revolution. But you can examine this in more detail at your leisure. But you see things like steam power is over there, the automobile over there. Okay. So there's some of the detail. Germ theory. Before that, they didn't know what caused disease. So then the discovery of antibiotics is somewhere in there. What we have here, if we were to put this in terms of GDP, this would be many hundredfold, maybe thousandfold. And it would still not capture everything that really was going on here. Because as was discussed last night, GDP, while something that is perhaps quite useful, is also something that is hopelessly incomplete in a sense, sometimes misleading. Most particularly, GDP is a quantitative measure of changes in value that misses out on essential qualitative changes. So if you were to think of how to measure changes, say, from 1,000 years ago until now in terms of GDP, you would get a change that's many thousand-fold. So you could say people's incomes increased maybe 1,000 times. Now, what did they spend that income on, that increase in income on? Did they spend it on the same things as they had back then? Of course not. You can't even begin to make the comparisons. You can't even begin to compare the kinds of things, the stuff that they had available to them and what this meant to them in terms of value. And I'll talk about what value means in a moment. So it is actually impossible to capture some of the qualitative changes that take place and what is antibiotics worth to people who have them today compared to back then when they didn't have them. Do we really have a number for that? So we miss out on these qualitative changes, and the way we teach economics actually accentuates that omission. So what are the causes of this wealth miracle that occurred? Well, Adam Smith gives two basic causes, to be very quick about it. The one is very familiar, this idea of the division of labor, right? He said that when the market grows in extent, that allows us to divide up tasks in a greater degree, and that improves productivity to a miraculous extent. And then the second reason he gives has to do with the institutional environment in which the division of labor is organized. Because you understand the division of labor is not something that happens, it is an organizing principle, right? It happens as a result of decisions that are taken because of incentives and expectations. So what kind of institutional background is necessary for the achievement of this division of labor? Adam Smith refers to it as that system of natural liberty, what we would call today classical liberalism. So the division of labor, maybe you know this argument already. If you've learned anything about Adam Smith, he gives three basic reasons as to why it works. He says it saves on time because in the old guild system, craftsmen would have to move from one task to another if they were doing many. This took time. It also saves on materials because they'd have to carry inventories of many different things that they had to use for different tasks. But most importantly, the third reason is he believed that the division of labor encourages innovation. It encourages innovation because people learn by doing. As they specialize, they learn about it more. So as we will see in a moment later on, the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek, when he re-examined Adam Smith's ideas, he said really what Adam Smith was talking about was not only a division of labor, but also a division of knowledge. So the story is familiar, and yet Adam Smith's account, while correct, as I said, is somewhat incomplete from our perspective. In particular, it seems that neither Adam Smith nor any of his contemporaries, nor the couple of generations of economists following him, really had a good grasp of what value means. And it wasn't until 1871 that the Austrian economist Karl Menger and two other economists, Leon Walras in Switzerland and France, and William Stanley Jevons in England, but mainly Menger in Vienna, addressed this question of what is value. And this, you may know or may not know, occurred in 1871, almost 100 years after the Wealth of Nations, is known as the marginalist revolution. Maybe we should even call it the subjectivist revolution. So I want to just highlight 2 points that Menger makes in his path-breaking principles of economics. 2 essential and related points. Number 1, which is familiar to us from classroom economics, is the idea that value is determined at the margin, right? So we have this idea, we understand now that the price is not equal to value, except for the last unit that you purchased. So if you buy 20 apples a week, we may ask, why don't you buy 21? And the logical answer would be because the price of apples is not worth to you the 21st apple. Why don't you buy 19? Because the price to you is less than the value, the price is less than the value to you of the 19th apple. Therefore, the price is a good reflection, or is worth it to you, for the 20th apple. You may say, insofar as we can measure value, we measure it only at the margin. This is a very important idea. And you use if you're studying economics, you use marginal analysis all the time. You do your constraint maximizations as the first derivative. So this is not a new idea. But the truth really is that perhaps the first derivative of an objective function doesn't really capture what is going on. There's a psychological or a subjective, a mental element to it. That is to say, the value being placed on something by the valuer. And that's the second point here that is decidedly not emphasized in your classroom economics. And that is that value is subjective. And this may seem a trivial thing, but yet I find in conversation with people, popular conversation, it is something that is forgotten or violated. This basic truth is violated in people's discussions insofar as they tend to assume, they tend to fall into the trap of thinking that value is determined by the cost of production of something. This is what the classical economists thought. This is the basis of Marxist system and basis of many related systems. But it is decidedly not the basis of market economics. Value comes from the mind to the thing, not from the thing to the mind. Value doesn't exist in something. Although my financial colleagues use the phrase intrinsic value, there's no such thing as intrinsic value. Value is not intrinsic. Value is in the head of the valuer. Value should be a verb, not a noun. And if you forget this, I'd say probably the vast majority of economic fallacies come from forgetting this basic point. One important consequence of this basic point is this. Value can be created and destroyed. Value is not a physical property. It's a mental property. It's the value that we put on something, right? Because it's subjective, people resist this because of, later on, what I'm going to explain to you, called a phenomenon known as scientism. People reject this because they think if something is not objective, it's not real. But it's very real. Value is a very real thing. It's like love. Would anybody argue that it's not real? Like fear. These are the most important things in a way, you might say. And they're very determinative, right? These, we use them to explain many other things. So unlike something physical, unlike mass energy, which can neither be created or destroyed because of the covering laws of physics, right, thermodynamics, we know that that we human beings on Earth cannot create mass or energy. We can simply transform it so that what you put in some sense is exactly equal to what you take out, and that leads you to reasoning in terms of a zero-sum game, because what you gain here must be accounted for by what you've lost here. In economics, it's not true. Value can be created and as sure as heck can be destroyed. But in fact, economic growth is nothing more and nothing less than the creation of value for people. So that's the part I wanted to emphasize that maybe is somewhat new to you with the marginalist revolution. And Adam Smith can be read as saying, in a way, that this creation of value occurs most efficiently in a system that allows for the intelligent, profitable division of labor. Now, what is the second story that Adam Smith is talking about? Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is basically the idea of the classical liberal ingredients, the ingredients that the classical liberals talk about when they talk about a free society. So we're talking about private property, we're talking about freedom of contract, we're talking about freedom of speech, so you can tell people about what you have, how you can benefit their lives, and so on. In fact, we could say, according to this, people have inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and property. In case you didn't get the reference, the Declaration of Independence, date 1776, of the United States, same date as the Wealth of Nations, says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and in possession of certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Benjamin Franklin changed property to the pursuit of happiness because he thought it would be less controversial. But these were not new ideas. So there's the basic institutional structure, and if those are in place, says Adam Smith, the system will work. He says the result in a system of the division of labor with a background of natural liberty, the results will be beneficial even if they're not intended to be. He says, give me that which I want, and you shall have this which you want. It is in this manner that we obtain from one another the greater part of those good offices which we stand in need of. And I don't know if you know this famous quote, hope you do. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, it's not from the compassion, the generosity, the charitable inclinations of the butcher, the brewer, the baker, that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest, you could say self-interest, right? We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. And as much as I repeat this over and over again to students and people, and they understand it, they still fall again into the trap of thinking that if you have a system in which people's intentions are wrong, the way to fix it is to change their intentions. And in fact, they devalue something good that comes if it was not intended. But this is a mistake, because as Adam Smith says later on, he doesn't see much good that has come out of good intentions, out of doing something for the public good. So another part of that comes out of this idea that it's not from the benevolence of the butcher that we get our dinner, that we get our meat, but from his attention. He feeds us not because he cares about us. He may care about us. Doesn't mean he's selfish. He may not be. But he gives us our dinner because he cares about his family. So he needs to make a profit to feed his family. We don't want him to give us meat because he cares about us. Because if he does, he's going to go bankrupt and we won't get our meat. The whole system will fail. So it's not that we don't want people to have good intentions or we don't want them to be charitable. Of course we do. But it's saying that being charitable is neither necessary nor sufficient for the system to work. And if it were, the system would fail. Because you can't rely on a big system, on an extended order system that just runs on good intentions. How does the system work? Well, the phrase invisible hand comes up. The system works because it's part of a complex system that self-adjusts. Although the intentions are not necessarily to help others, the people acting in that way are led as if by an invisible hand. So he talks about an individual investing. He's led in this, as in so many other things, by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Adam Smith uses that phrase only once in The Wealth of Nations, but it become quite famous, and it's called invisible hand explanations. So I just want to emphasize that what we have here is in Adam Smith's invisible hand system is a system that harmonizes the interests of the individual with the interests of society, but it does it automatically because the butcher really works to benefit him and ends up benefiting us. Adam Smith says, I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. So this idea that actually all good intentions at the public policy level have unintended consequences, and those unintended consequences are not so good. Now this, as I will actually amplify in my second talk, I think on Wednesday, this explanation really refers to something that Adam Smith was not aware of, but was made manifest, was made clear by later writers, in particular Friedrich Hayek. He was referring to what we may call a complex self-adaptive system, a system that is part of a complex set of relationships, or describes a complex set of relationships. Now, complex is another word for complicated, but that's not exactly what it means here. You may be familiar with the term complexity studies. So the world of complexity is a world that is completely different, qualitatively different from simple phenomena, a world of simple phenomena. Complex phenomena have certain characteristics like unpredictability, like impossible to understand the whole thing. Not only economics, but other kinds of social systems, languages, and biology are all complex systems, and many of them are self-adjusting. So Adam Smith was really talking about complex self-adjusting systems. So this begins to become clear at the beginning of the 20th century. By the end of the 19th century, the period of laissez-faire was already more or less over in terms of the intellectual climate. I put it this way. The tide turns against laissez-faire, against the idea of free markets. Adam Smith's ideas were very well understood, not only by intellectuals, but by policymakers as well. And it was quite persuasive. It led to a period in England, because of the dynamic changes that were taking place, the new business class, the declining landed class, and the interests were self-aligned. They abolished the laws upon the importation of corn and so on. But by the end of the 19th century, there are many naysayers, right? There's the rise of socialism, in England in particular. And by the 1920s, Friedrich Hayek says he's a young student in Vienna at the University of Vienna, and he says if you're studying, if you're young and you're at university, then by definition you're a socialist. And he said, Ludwig von Mises wrote a book called Socialism. He wrote an article in 1918 and a book published in 1922 called Socialism that basically influenced a whole generation. Ludwig von Mises was a disciple, one generation removed, of Karl Menger in the Austrian school. So Hayek becomes embroiled in the early 1930s in a debate that started with Mises in the 1920s called the socialist calculation debate. And this is a very involved debate that goes on for about 10 years. In fact, Oskar Lange from Poland was a neoclassical socialist. He and a bunch of other economists said you can take the model of perfect competition and you can apply it seamlessly, perfectly, to a socialist economy to get the results of free competition. And Mises and Hayek would try to explain why this is not so. So I don't want to go into detail on that, but just to explain why Hayek wrote this very important article in 1945 after the socialist calculation debate was over, called The Use of Knowledge in Society. Now, this article is on, or it was, I don't know if it's still, but at least when I was at Chicago, was on my price theory microeconomic reading list. It's on perhaps every microeconomic reading list. It's there. You might say it's much cited, but not very well read. Sometimes people see it, they read it quickly, or they don't read it at all, and not altogether well understood, but perhaps one of the best statements around for why the market economy works. Basically, Hayek says, as I described before, Adam Smith was right, but he didn't go far enough. What he didn't realize is that the division of labor is also a division of knowledge. In a market economy, the knowledge of how to do things does not reside in any one mind or in the mind of any group of people in some kind of central capacity. Rather, knowledge is dispersed, and it also cannot be aggregated because much of it is tacit. In any case, we should make a distinction between information and knowledge, right? Information is objective, knowledge is subjective. But even so, you can aggregate information, and if people can interpret it, knowledge can be shared. Except that some form of knowledge is not shareable. It's what we call tacit knowledge. The philosophers have a good time with this. Most of the knowledge that we have is tacit. That means it cannot be communicated. We know it, but we don't know that we know it, or even if we know that we know it, we cannot describe it. You can all ride a bicycle. Can you describe to me how to ride a bicycle? You just know how to do it, right? So this is a big problem in all of organizational behavior. In many respects, Hayek has influenced management studies in even more than he's influenced economics, much more. Because a lot of his work has been now the motivating force for how to organize a society, particularly in the knowledge economy. Do you bring the decision maker to the person who has the specialized non-communicable knowledge? Do you bring the decision-making power to him? Or do you bring the knowledge to the person who can make the decisions? So there's some very real practical questions that come out of Hayek's insights. So I just want to read to you this quote, which is important. I'm running out of time. They're important for understanding what Hayek is talking about. This is a famous quote, and it begins his article with this. He says, "The economic problem of any society is thus not merely a problem of how to allocate given resources, if given is taken to mean given to a single mind which deliberately solves the problem set by these data. It is rather a problem of how to secure the best use of resources known to any of the members of the society for ends whose relative importance, whose value, only these individuals know. Or to put it briefly, it is a problem of the utilization of knowledge which is not given to anyone in its totality." So economics, I just say this, economics from this particular point of view is certainly at the macro level fundamentally not a solution to a specifiable quantitative problem. It is not. Hayek talks about how prices coordinate activities. Why? Because prices act in the same capacity as both incentives and as signals. How do we know that it works? We know that it works, but we don't know exactly how. Does it always work? That's something else to talk about. And the other thing about it is the economy is never in equilibrium. So this bears upon how we interpret things like profits. From the classroom textual analysis, textbook analysis of economics, profits indicate inefficiencies because it's an equilibrium point of view in which only price competition is taking place. From Hayek's point of view, profits indicate value created unless they are a result of special protections. So there are some fundamental differences that we can talk about maybe in discussion, but the end of the sort of story of success is this, is that if you have property prices and profits, they lead you basically to utilization of information, incentives, and innovation, which the entrepreneur puts together in order to create value. That's Hayek's system, okay? So what did you learn in economics, you know? I titled the second part, The Closing of the Economic Mind. What happened to all of this? Where is it? If you're learning in economics in the classroom, you're learning mainly what we call the pure logic of choice. You're learning a lot about quantitative methods. You're learning about techniques. I'm not saying that nothing of this dynamic view creeps in. I am saying that very little does. And why is this the case? I think there are two reasons. In a nutshell, scientism and statism. They go together. What is scientism? Why is it that the economics mind closed? How do we explain that? Scientism is basically the dogmatic reduction of all scientific knowledge to only that which is measurable. Hayek referred to that as the abuse of science. We joke, those of us who are critical of this standard economics, we joke that it's the result of physics envy. Economics is responsible for the neglect by the profession. Scientism is responsible in economics for the neglect by the profession, by professional economists, of much of the research program suggested by Adam Smith's pioneering work. This is some of the things that you will encounter if you adopt a scientific point of view. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. If you can't measure it, it's not science. We won't publish it. We won't teach it. If you can't write it in mathematics, it's not science. We won't publish it. We won't teach it. Now, statism is the use of the state for the agenda of the policymakers in terms of basically given power by those who have their faith in their benevolence and in their omnipotence and their ability to achieve what they want. And actually, statism comes from a form of scientism, or scientism supports statism, because statism is based on the idea that if you throw enough money after a particular agenda and you put the right people in charge, two things will happen. Number one, they will have the knowledge to achieve what they want to achieve. And number two, that they will have the desire to achieve what is stated that they should achieve, or what they state they want to achieve. In other words, we have basically in every governance situation, private or public, we have two problems: an incentive problem and a knowledge problem. The incentive problem is the basis of what we call modern public choice theory. The knowledge problem was very much emphasized by the Austrians, but also the incentive problem. So scientism basically banishes those two problems, and the economics profession more or less gave in to the temptations of the socialist allure. I'm old enough now to say, to remember changes in the profession over 3 or 4 decades. It's absolutely astounding to see the change in the way that economists are sort of migrated into a situation of social engineering. So my story is almost over. I just want to highlight some of the things that you learn in traditional economics. There's a great emphasis on equilibrium. What exactly equilibrium means is not much discussed, because it's really, there's a lot of focus on its technical dimensions. But there's not much discussion, or perhaps no discussion, on disequilibrium. In fact, very often the problem is posed, here is the objective, here are the means towards the objective. What is the solution to the problem? You find the equilibrium. Everybody said, well, wait a minute, how do we know we're going to get into the equilibrium? Sometimes they develop dynamic adjustment properties, but they're based on very, very simplistic assumptions. So I'm not saying that this pure logic of choice is useless. It's something that I teach what I call alternative economics at my business school. I'm lucky I teach in business school, not in the economics department. So I can say I teach them applied economics or alternative economics. I teach them the logic of choice. I elected to throw out indifference curves a few years ago, but I teach them basically income and substitution effects. I teach them some aspects of constraint maximization. I teach them some basic logic of choice. It's important to understand the logic of choice, basically economizing, right? It's important to understand how the equimarginal principle, that you maximize something by making sure that you spend your money so that the marginal utility per dollar is equalized. All of that is very important, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. It doesn't equip anybody with the ability to give policy advice, economic advice. And if you get into higher economics, what you get really is the progressive, more sophisticated, more technical development of this logic of choice, so that basically our graduates in economics end up learning more and more about less and less. It's a question very much of what is seen and what is not seen. Because I've interviewed for positions at our school from the top universities, and when we interview the candidates, they are not only ignorant of a lot of the things I'm talking about, they are ignorant of their ignorance. They don't know what they don't know because it's not seen. So I compiled for you, I'm not going to go through this, but I compiled for you at your leisure to go through this table to sort of ask yourself, or those of you who are not economic students for your own interest, you can see over here on the left, I talk about some of the things that you're taught in school, and here's what you won't learn, what I call alternative economics. So there's my thesis again. Often the policy is dead wrong. Very often it's irrelevant. So maybe you have some questions. I also compiled a reading list, by the way, a short reading list in case you want it. Yeah, right on time.
Just ask the first question. I'd like to explore for a minute the point of self-interest.
Yes.
What you're talking about, I understood that everybody benefits by everyone pursuing self-interest. And I understand maybe, there's students here who grew up in Israel, in a great sense here, the idea of fairness and social justice. And one question is, how is this contradictory to the sense of social justice, and how do you make everyone better off? To get to the central point, or question is, I think when one talks about individuals pursuing their self-interest, I think it possibly misses the sense of what's really going on, in the sense that entrepreneurs are quintessentially concerned with what other people are about. You can't, entrepreneurs by definition have to be humble people. I think, we listened to a guy last night who's a great entrepreneur, making a lot of money. And it was very clear this is a guy who has a sense that he has a very limited knowledge of the totality of the world. So entrepreneurs are constantly thinking about what other people want so they can serve their needs. So I think it's important to clarify this, that when we're talking about self-interest, we're not talking about selfishness where you're only focused on yourself. In classical sense of elitist.
Right.
You're really talking about a situation where people are very focused on other people and serving their needs. So I thought maybe you could develop that a little bit.
Of course, I mean, this is something that I talk about at length, and we'll be happy to expound on it. And I would urge you to try and leave behind the idea that the free market system may be effective, but it's not moral, that it sort of functions on the basis of selfishness. This is a myth. This is a total myth. It's not only inaccurate, it is the exact opposite of the truth. In order to sort of understand this, we can employ the distinction that Bob made between self-interest and selfishness, right? Ayn Rand, some of you may have heard of Ayn Rand. She's was a liberal, classical liberal, libertarian philosopher of sorts, and obviously brilliant. I didn't care much for her novels, and she wrote, I think she maybe, some of her writing was counterproductive because she came across as an incredibly non-sympathetic person. And she wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. Now, the way that she meant it, she can defend it, because she could defend anything to anybody. But by clever semantic tricks, she could twist it and say, well, you don't understand what selfishness is. But in the usual sense of the word, selfishness, this is not about selfishness or selflessness or anything like that. When you say that somebody's behavior is selfish, what you're doing, you're not making a statement that can be verified. You're making a judgment about whether or not you approve or disapprove of their actions. When you say that somebody's behavior is self-interested, you're making a statement that cannot be denied. It's not a question of, it's not an assumption, it's a fact. Insofar as people act, they act purposefully, which means they have a purpose they're trying to achieve. Now, that purpose could be charitable work. Mother Teresa relocated from India to New York City. You know Mother Teresa? She was a great charitable, she did a lot of charitable work in India. She had a huge organization. She moved from India to New York. Why? Because she believed in capitalism? Why did she move to New York? Why do you think? Why didn't she stay in India?
Raise money.
Well, what?
Influence.
Connections? That's what you think?
Self-interest.
Yeah, it was her self-interest, but why did she better able to meet her self-interest in New York?
To get more resources.
Because in New York, she could sign a contract. Back in New York was better than it is now. She could sign a contract that she knew would be enforced. She could get resources that she knew would be protected. If the lights went out, she could call someone and get them fixed. So she benefits from the capitalist system, if you like, the free market system, to achieve her ends. When we talk about non-profit organizations, that's an accounting definition. From an economic point of view, every organization is a profit-making organization. A non-profit-making organization, a charitable organization, my son-in-law is a non-profit attorney, he believes in free markets because he understands he can get done more of what he wants. He can better able to reach his donors. He's better able to reach his targets of people that he wants to benefit. And his objective is to maximize the difference between his donors and his expenses so that he has more to give away. It doesn't matter what this notion of self-interest doesn't say anything about selfishness or what the objective is. It's about the free market as a means to the achievement of whatever it is that you want. And it is an empirical fact that people do better, poor people do better in capitalist, in free market societies than they do in societies that state as the objective to benefit them, particularly those societies that desire to achieve some form of social justice. Because social justice, who's to decide what that is? And who's going to implement that? Can you trust them? Do they know what they're doing? How does it end up working? So if you really care about people, what's the best you can do? You can promote a system in which each individual has the greatest chance to achieve his or her particular objectives, whatever they may be. So I would defend the morality of the market every bit as much as I would defend its efficiency, because they're basically the same thing. Yes?
Talked about what economics shouldn't be.
Yes.
But I didn't exactly understand what it should be. For example, how economic research should be conducted exactly.
How economic research, okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in my second lecture. But economic research right now is a very narrow area. For example, there's no history in it. So you don't do much history, you don't do any history of thought. The alternative economics, where you study complex system, works under the realization that you, in social science with the complex systems, you cannot make quantitative predictions. This is something that the mainstream of economics doesn't like at all, because from the perspective of somebody looking at it, they have a scientific presumption. So they want to estimate things like elasticities of demand, actual quantitative estimates at the 5% level, and all these kinds. They use an objective notion of probability, which actually doesn't work in a complex system. From the alternative system, the way you do empirical work is to study history, because actually econometrics is just boring history. But you study a richer history. I mean, I'm happy to expand on that, but if you really want to look, you can look at the economics program at George Mason University, which is one of the programs, and some of the other universities that are going up around the world. Basically, it is an economics that is much broader, less pretentious in terms of its quantitative and technical precision, but more subtle, more insightful. It asks of the students that they not just be technicians, but that they be a little bit of a philosopher, a little bit of a sociologist, a little bit of a political economist, to understand human beings and what subjective value really means. Yes?
I have actually two questions. You say that it doesn't make not always right to invest a lot of money or in the right people to solve a problem. It doesn't solve it all the time. What do you mean?
Seldom solve.
Why not?
Why would it? We give money to the government, why would the government know how to do anything? What gives the government special knowledge to know anything?
They have the best economists, I guess.
The economists don't know how to take education, right?
But when the American economy was in downfall in 2008 and they invested in the bailout, more than $1,000 billion.
Yes.
Did it help?
No.
Should it help?
No. Not only did it not help, we're 7 years into the recession and we haven't recovered. And it's because of those kinds of policies.
But why did we do it?
Why did we do it? Because of scientism. What we might call a crony capital. The big banks are very much in bed with big government. In this case, the Fed, the Federal Reserve System. I mean, that's a whole other area. But the impetus for the bailout and for the massive infusion of reserves into the system in 2008 comes from an incorrect reading. This is also an answer to your question. Comes from an incorrect reading of the episode of the Great Depression. Ben Bernanke learned his economics from Milton Friedman, who taught that the Great Depression was caused by a massive contraction of the money supply, which may have been correct. But Bernanke took the lesson that therefore what we need to do is a massive infusion of the money supply, and kept on going for 6 years. At one to $80 billion a month purchase of government bonds. So what it resulted was not a recovery, but a perpetuation of the recession, of the inefficient banks and the inefficient lending, and a distortion of resources. The housing market was overbought, right? So what we needed was to reallocate resources away from the housing market to where they could be employed in a sustainable way. The housing market was overbought because of bad economic policies, low interest rates, a depreciation of lending standards. So we got a massive distortion of resources. Many people were surprised by the recession. I wasn't. Not anybody who thinks of economics like I was surprised. In fact, I saw it as exactly connected to the dot-com bust. We never recovered from that. We've had the last 15 years of sustained bad economic policy, the worst economic policy in 100 years.
How do you solve this problem if not with conventional methods?
You downsize the government. You get the Federal Reserve back out. Basically, the performance of the economy is inversely related to the relative size of government and the ubiquity of regulations. There's no quick fix. You know, it's pay now or pay more later.
So the market fixes itself?
The market fixes itself. Of course, it's self-adjusting. That doesn't mean it's utopia. It means that you can't make it better. Right? Capitalism is the worst system you can think of, except for every other system. There's no heaven on earth. The trouble comes from pretending you can achieve heaven on earth, and if you're a politician, you can buy votes by promising people to give them heaven.
Yeah, but you can't give a push to the free market to fix himself and himself.
How do you know where to push? How do you know how much to push? How do you know what interest rate is right? How do you know the person who's giving the push is doing it for the right reasons and not for their own career? Aren't you asking a lot of them? Are we surprised when they do things to serve the bankers rather than to serve the nation? Where do the regulators come from? They come from the bankers.
Okay, I have another question. You say that we can't. Okay. You say that the today economical models are more times not complete or even failing. And you also say that there are things in economy that you can't measure, so it doesn't count for a lot of professors that teach us. What do you mean? What can we measure exactly?
What can we measure?
What can't we measure?
Qualitative changes. There are many you can't measure the price of a cell phone in 1960.
Yeah, but today, what can we measure and it actually affects us and we don't understand it?
You can't measure the value of the capital stock.
Okay. I actually thought more about culture or, I don't know.
Yeah, that's fine. You just asked me for an example. I'll agree with that too. Culture is very, you're gonna hear from Professor Lal. I mean, he's a world expert on these, on all many different influences on economic development. Culture is a very important, the value of traditions. The value of traditions, institutions. I'm going to talk more about that in my second talk. But yeah, you know, there is a huge qualitative aspect to society that we miss completely. I mean, even the quantitative measures are inaccurate. For example, there is a huge amount of consumer surplus that we don't measure. Think of it something to think about. If you take the GDP is composed of prices and quantities of billions of different components, right? That means the same GDP total can be arrived at an infinite number of ways. Can we say that each way is economically equivalent? Yeah.
You talked about free market, but as I see it, the more the market, the more it is very unreliable, because as I saw it in 2008, because they didn't regulate the use of derivatives, this was the cause of the problem. And if the government could interfere in a sooner stage of the problem, the fall could be less catastrophic. And I agree that the market will fix itself, but as I see it, if the government will have some kind of a foot placement in the process, it will be. I think it's very important.
Look, as an interpretation of history, I think that is the exact opposite of the truth. That everything that you said is exactly the opposite. But before I answer why, let me ask you, why do you think the market is unreliable, but you think government is reliable?
I don't think, but I think that you have to count on something and to say that you can't count on the government, so you should downsize it and
What is
market,
there? What is there in any government action working towards the insurance of reliability?
They want to make sure that the market.
They have good intentions. Good intentions.
They want to get re-elected. Sorry to settle.
The process of getting re-elected doesn't depend on so much on getting the economy right as on delivering to your constituency what they need, what they think they need, or what you promised them.
Well, that's pretty much the same. I mean,
And it's correct. Let's say that the health of the economy is a strong part of it. You elect somebody once every 4 years, once every 2 years. What is there in the market to ensure reliability? Every single day.
Don't you think that the problem in 2008 could be resolved if the government will interfere in a sooner stage?
Absolutely not. I mean, I could not say more emphatically not. The whole problem that occurred in 2008 wasn't a result of too little regulation.
So,
What did they deregulate? They removed some of the distinctions between investment banking and commercial banking.
they didn't regulate the derivative markets because they didn't interfere in time.
What could they regulate the derivative markets?
They could.
They don't know what they're doing.
We are doing it today. We are in Israel. We make sure that not everyone can get a loan, but you have to have a basic fortune.
Now, why does the government know this, but the people who are selling the loans don't?
Because they didn't care, because they passed.
Why didn't they care?
Because they passed on the loans for people itself, and if they have like 2 days that they sustain the loan, then they give it to other people. They don't really care what will happen to them because.
Let me tell you what I think. I think what happened, it had nothing to do with regulation. I think the derivative market came about because of a misguided attempt in America to achieve social justice. Social justice meant that there are certain groups, minorities, who didn't own homes to the same degree as the rest of the population. So they set about on a 3-decade-long project which accelerated in the last 10 years before the crash, in order to extend home ownership from 30% of the population to ultimately about 44% of the population. In order to do that, what they had to do was basically transform the entire mortgage industry to move it away. You talk about regulating. They forced the loan officers to go against their own better judgment and the adoption of their own tried and evolved standards, to abandon those standards and to simply basically give loans to almost anybody who applied to them. As a result, there was rampant speculation. Housing prices went up and up and up. People on Wall Street got the idea this will be a very good thing for an options market. People began to create these derivatives. Other people began to create derivatives based on hedging against the value of those derivatives. That was the result of the derivative problem. Not lack of regulation of the derivatives, but the bad economic policy that produced it. Regulation would not solve that problem, but that problem would never have occurred if they hadn't had the housing market distorted by these policies and financed by the Federal Reserve low interest rates. For 6 times in the year preceding this, we got interest rate reductions. And we haven't stopped. Interest rates are now close to zero. There's no market interest rate, actually. So That's why I think your perception is completely wrong.
But if they couldn't have rolled on the debt onto someone else, if they did have to hold the risk for the loans that they gave out, we wouldn't have been in this mess. I mean, they wouldn't have lent all this money if they didn't feel like they could never be held accountable. They didn't have to pay
sure,
when
they could
folded.
be held accountable. Somebody was the final holder. People made
Yeah,
millions
people
of
who didn't
dollars
know what
of
they were
profit.
holding.
Yes, they made mistakes. They made mistakes that were encouraged by speculation that was caused by bad economic policy. There is herding behavior in the market, psychology, of course. And people began to form expectations, not only on what the market is going to do, but on what the government is going to do to support the market. So they thought, not only is this housing market the new economy, not only are these prices going to continue to go up and up, but ultimately, if there's a threat that they're going to fall, then the government is going to support them because these banks are too big to fail. So they, as part of their calculus, they were shifting the risk not only to other people, but also onto the government, who they thought would come and bail them out.
They did.
Which they did. And other people did see it. People who went on the short end, who bought insurance against the value of these derivatives, these tranches of mortgage funds. And they made a lot of money. Yeah.
Well, before you talked about the government and bigger government, and you said that the bigger the government, the economy is less okay. What you said is that if the government is big, it's actually what it's doing is just damaging the economy. It's not doing something good. But we do have examples of governments that are big, and the economy is better, and you have socialism, like in Sweden, if I'm not mistaken. They have a real, relatively big government, about 120, something like that, and the economy over there is good, and you have socialism, and what it means is that you can have some kind of a mix of both things.
You know, that's the problem about, I'm going to talk to you about that in my next talk, is that history never speaks to us in one voice. We always have counterfactual assumptions. The Swedish economy, I don't know, I'm not an expert on the Swedish economy, but in terms of some dimensions, the Swedish economy is remarkably free. So although
the government size.
Yeah, but you know, when you count the size of the government, you also have to count regulations. You also have to count all these other kinds of things. To what extent, how easy it is to open a business, to what kinds of regulations you have to take into account, all of these dimensions. So the Swedish economy wasn't always doing so well. They made some reforms.
So what you're saying is not that
it's not single dimension.
Yeah,
I take your point.
What the government size is, the regulation.
It's not just the size of government expenditure, although that's a big part of it.
Because
there are also qualitative and quantitative aspects that are not part of expenditure.
Yeah, because you can have a big government and do well in the economy. So it has to take into account the regulations. Those are the problem.
Look, what does government produce?
You have things that they produce, mainly security.
Okay, so
Mainly.
right. So if government just focused on producing security, it would be much smaller. Of all the other things that it does, what does it do? And how does it finance it? The government cannot exist without the private sector. The government is by nature a parasite. Right? Yeah.
Most of the people doesn't know exactly what they're doing with the pension funds and the banking and the insurance company. And shouldn't we have a regulator, the government, that intervene and help these people that they not get cheated by these institutions?
So I also teach a course on regulation of business. I tell my students, there are only really two reasons why you can to justify government regulation. One is to produce security, to protect people, because that's something you can't do privately, you have to do collectively. And the other is because people are too stupid or too uninformed to help themselves. So you intervene because you know better than they do what's good for them. But you allow them to have children, to be parents. You allow them to vote. You allow them to eat red meat. You allow them to smoke. You allow them to cross the road, to go hang gliding, but you don't allow them to choose their pension fund? Do we have a free society? No. What does a free society mean if it doesn't mean that people should be free to make their own mistakes? And you as a free individual, you're free to tell them when you think they're making a mistake. Do we want a society of adults? Or do we want a society where the leaders are the results and the rest of the people are the children?
Yeah,
So realize what an elitist idea that is?
No, I mean, but it's the same reason you have a police. You say, all right, don't steal. I mean, you say to the big pension funds and the banking, don't steal, but that's not going to happen. You have the government
No,
have
the
to
police-
protect.
Well, why do you think the government would protect?
Again, the police. Why the police
Oh,
would protect?
yeah. Well, that's why you want to keep the police force small. Yeah.
I totally agree with the point for the causes of the mortgage crisis in a way. But the question is that, okay, the government shouldn't intervene or shouldn't regulate, but can't it create first-hand rules and basically how the economic policy and how should the market work? For example, you mentioned the Glass-Steagall Act. Should that be reinstated in your mind?
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, that's a specific piece of regulation. Although I understand the logic. I also teach money in banking, so I understand the logic of that. You know, is the Japanese system or the German system better than the American system? I don't know. It's sort of debatable. But again, next time I speak to you, I'll talk about Hayek and his view of institutions. And he wrote a book in 1960 called The Constitution of Liberty. Okay, so you may be familiar with it. And he talked about, you know, the reason why markets work is because when they work, is because they work within a system of well understood and widely accepted rules, most of which are not the result of government edict, but the result of evolution, of culture, of people understanding you know, what others expect of them and what they can expect from others. So there's a shared understanding. Government can feed into this, he agrees. But if it does, it should make rules that are abstract. In other words, they apply at the highest possible level of abstraction. They're not specific to institutions, they're not specific to people, but they're very abstract and universal. And it's like the rules of football, right? And then let the game be played. You don't handicap the players, you just apply the rules. So it's the rule of law rather than the rule of people. Now the question that I don't have an answer to is, how do you constrain the rulers to govern only by the rule of law? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should be careful not to fall on tax on the example. For example, was given here the example of Sweden as a successful country. Sometimes we search for successful examples as a proof of that the market system is good or bad, or the social. But we need to look at the relation between the government and the private sector in each country. The example of Sweden that is most quoted is a very unique example where there's the Wallenberg family who rules 50% of the economy. As you cannot see it as not related to the government himself. And so there is when you look for these examples, you need to look very careful. What is the relation of the private sector with the government? The size of the government, the Swedish economy is large, but also the private. If you look at the other side, the Wallenberg family, the private sector has a huge size. So and they complement each other pretty well. So that doesn't seem that it can repeat that in any country or in any economy. So it's you need to go to those kinds of relations in order to understand the full picture, and not fall on okay, here we have a socialist country that did well and a market capitalist economy that did bad because it was government entrenchment and there were bad guys running the economy of this kind of stuff.
Thank you. I don't know. Let's see. Yes.
In those days, we talk about the milky problem in the food market. And in Israel, there is 10 big companies that control the market: Coca-Cola, Tempo, Strauss. And I think it's because this government regulation before a couple years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
It's funny because when I visited Israel in 1965, there was no Coca-Cola. They didn't allow Coca-Cola to be imported or manufactured here because there were import controls. They thought they would develop a local. They had a local Coca-Cola industry that tasted terrible. So now Coca-Cola's here and they're regulated and subsidized or protected. That's what you're saying? Interesting. Crony capitalism. Crony capitalism is not capitalism. You understand the term crony? Crony means protectia, yeah. Yeah.
I have a slight indirect question on your thesis. I want to focus on your PhD, and I would like to hear a little more on your economic point of view on the apartheid government.
Did you all understand what she said? She's asking, I grew up in South Africa, she's asking me about the system of apartheid. Do you all know the system of apartheid? Israel has been accused of being an apartheid state. I grew up in apartheid. I know what it's like to live in a police state. So what do you want to know? What did my thesis consist of? Okay, well, I was very fortunate that I arrived at the University of Chicago when Gary Becker had just come a couple of years before. And Gary Becker, who was a student of Milton Friedman, did his thesis on the economics of discrimination. So when I came, I was a little older, being out of a foreign student, so I was a little older than a lot of the Americans, and I had some economics already, and I was already specializing in money and banking, but I decided with Becker there, economics of discrimination, coming from South Africa, I can apply his theory to the economics of apartheid, and that's what I did. So very quickly, Becker's thesis is that in a market system, it is expensive to discriminate. If you have competition in a system, if somebody, say, doesn't hire women because they don't want to work with women, or doesn't hire black people or Hispanic people or whatever because they discriminate against them, they hurt themselves as well as the people they don't hire. And if the system is open, non-discriminators will have a cost advantage. Because in an open system, people who are discriminated against can offer to work for less. Under the current system, they would say that's socially unjust. But in an open system, it makes sense because that's the way they can break into the system. In the end, they will end up earning the same with competition. But in the process, basically, discrimination will be eroded by the system of competition. That was Becker's thesis. I took his work and I said, apply this to South Africa. In South Africa, what happened is that the white minority used the government to enforce discrimination so that competition doesn't work, and made discrimination legal. In other words, state discrimination. So state discrimination is not eroded by the competitive system, but is upheld. In fact, it reinforces discriminatory attitudes, and an open market erodes discriminatory attitudes. Not only results, but attitudes, because it forces people to work together. Yeah.
You mentioned before that we cannot measure what we cannot see, but are we supposed to allocate money efficiently if we cannot really measure what profit? So it's kind of...
Who's we? You mean businesses?
The business, the government, like eventually we kind of...
The government has a hopeless task. Just like in the Soviet Union, they had to allocate on the basis of what we call shadow prices. In other words, to try and take and look at prices in the market. But businesses use accounting.
Yeah,
And accounting are estimates.
we have the kind of like the net present value theory, but
Right.
if we cannot see the real profit, so there is kind of like a market failure in this choosing the right project.
There's no market failure. Market failure is mostly a myth. There's no such thing. What it is there's no correct or right profit. What there is an accounting, an attempt to account for the results of certain actions. So profit is the feedback from the market, from consumers telling you what they like and what they didn't like. It's not an objective measure. It is a reflection of the values of what consumers put upon the things that you produced for them. And on the basis of that, you price the labor that you employ, or the machines that you employ, or the buildings that you employ. So accounting is, this was in the socialist calculation debate. Accounting gives us a way, the only way. It doesn't give us objective measures. It gives us a way to estimate and to share those estimates to inform us as to how we should act. So profit is a measure. It's a reflection of transactions that have occurred and what people say. GDP?
GDP that measure one thing and profit measure only the objective.
Well, I don't know. I'm not quite sure what GDP measures in that sense, because I mean, GDP, it's a calculation of other people's estimates. No, an entrepreneur in a business makes a judgment, right? About an entrepreneur, the process of entrepreneurship is very important. And that's one of the things that's left out. That's one of the things that's not seen. All of you who are studying economics at university, how much do you study entrepreneurship? Because in textbook economics, the entrepreneur doesn't exist. But in real world economics, the economy doesn't exist without the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is the person who's gambling, who's making a guess. Steve Jobs or somebody thinks that consumers are going to like this square box. When I first saw this, I thought that's ridiculous. I can't dial on the screen. But the entrepreneur, I was in a business. I was in a $6 billion business, not a $144 billion business like Michael. But I was in a business in the right place, right time for 5 years with a friend of mine. And he had a vision about the application of computers in businesses, 1984 to 1991. And he was right. He was guessing, and he was right. And he made a profit. Why did he make a profit? Because he was able to exchange things to people in return for general purchasing power, which we could then use to pay people and have left over some, which we call profit. And those businesses which make a profit survive, and those that don't. And that's how you make a decision. You make a gamble. The entrepreneur, that's how he allocates resources. Is it efficient? Is it optimal? I don't even know, in that context, I don't even know what that means. Compared to what?
It seems that all the economic experts have a thesis similar to yours. Why doesn't the government adopt this approach?
They're not similar to me. I say there are two kinds of economists. There are those who pretend they can predict, and there are those who admit that they don't, that they can't. The former get paid much more. I'm a member of the latter. When television, they call me up to speak on television and they ask me, if I say I don't know, that's the last time they're going to ask me. So think of the selection process. You're selecting out all those people who are truthful enough to say they don't know. You're selecting out all of those who are going to tell the painful truth. And you leave those who support state statism. Those are the people.
So why the government prefer to take the first thesis?
Because the government is in a political race, a democratic race, that it will win by promising to deliver what people want at other people's expense. And the economists who tell them they can do that are the economists who will get the jobs. How can you work against that dilemma? That's the eternal question. Only by very firm and widely respected constitutional guarantees. It has not been done very often. The United States is like, what, not even 300 years old. It's a very interesting experiment, but how much longer can it go on? We'll see.
You can't get votes with your theory?
No, it's very difficult to sell. It's very difficult to sell. You have it like Michael was talking about last night. If you go to people and you say, look, we're going to have a disruptive transformation. We cannot avoid it. We have to make these changes, we have to do them quickly. If we delay, we'll have to make the changes that will be more painful. You get another economist who comes along and says, he's talking nonsense. You want to elect somebody like that who's going to allow your jobs to be destroyed? I'm going to use the full power of the United States government, of the Israeli government, to make sure that this doesn't happen to you. We don't need messages of doom. No brainer, no contest. Yeah.
This is going back to what you said about self-interest and incentives and whatnot. And or when I talk to people about these things, people who aren't economics, I think the idea of an economic system that's based on self-interest is something that's hard to sell. I mean, when you talk to people, they're always talking about fairness. It's not fair that this person found natural gas and now he's selling it and making all this money and we don't get any of it. It's not fair that high-paid executives are making all this money and I work so hard and I don't get anything. And I think we're trying to talk about, I mean, we all agree that incentives are important and you can't just take money from people once they've made it because you'll destroy it, but you'll destroy the system. But it's hard to convince people to understand that, so how do you do it?
Okay, very quickly, and then, because we're coming to the end, I think. Okay, I would say two things. Number one, you have to try and convince them that equality is a false norm. People think in terms of equality. Equality is not a norm, it's not a value. Inequality is not a problem. Poverty is a problem. If the poorest person in the economy earned $1 million, and the richest person earned $1 billion, we have a lot of inequality. But do we have a problem? Why do we have a problem? If somebody can run 100 yards in 100 meters in 10 seconds, and somebody like me, it takes 20 seconds, there's a lot of inequality there. Is that a problem? Somebody was lucky enough to inherit better genes than me when it comes to running. Inequality is a fact of life. It's not a problem. Poverty may be a problem. So then ask them this, secondly. Say, posit three changes. Say you have a situation where you want to take some money away from the rich and give it to the poor. They'll say, yeah, I'm for that. Because rich people often, they just inherited, they didn't earn it or whatever. Let's take a lot of money and give it to the poor. Take, $10,000 away from the rich and give it to the poor. They like that. And I say, what if we take $10,000 away from the poor and give it to the rich? No, they don't like that at all. I say, well, what happens if we give $10,000 to the poor and nothing to the rich? They like that. What happens if you give $10,000 to the poor and $10,000 to the rich? Well, now they're thinking, okay. Well, what happens if you give $10,000 to the poor and $100,000 to the rich? Would you vote for that? They would say no. Why not? You're depriving the poor of $10,000 because you don't want the rich to get it? What is the emotion objecting to that? Envy, resentment? Is that a worthy emotion?
That's what I'm saying. That's what people feel.
I know.
They don't care about what's.
Well, I don't know how to combat. I don't know how to combat that except to say if your kid in kindergarten expressed those kinds of emotions, you would chastise. You would say that's immoral. We don't envy people. We're not jealous of people's success. We like to share in their success, just because we're not as successful as they are. If a society develops by a few people getting fabulously wealthy and the rest of the people getting wealthy at a steady rate, that's a bad thing.
I'll bring you to my living room. We can try and sell that.
Try it. Let me know how it works.
Right.
Okay, thank you.